This is, I think, somewhat of a defining moment in my writing career, is to have a book that has survived this long. Originally, I did plan on making a video about how I was going to approach revisions for Draft 2, but I do have to come clean. I'm officially done with Draft 2 of my fantasy debut. That means when I start working on Of Wreck and Ruin, I will officially be working on Draft 3. For those of you who are new here, my name is AJ. I'm an aspiring author currently working on the first book in my fantasy series that I'm hoping to self-publish once they are done. So for any of you who are interested, I figured it would be fun to talk a little bit about the differences between Draft 1 and Draft 2 and get a little bit more into some writing reflections, talk about some of the areas that I feel like I grew in, as well as some of the areas that I still have to work on when I go into Draft 3. So please get comfortable and let's just get into it. For comparisons and for my number-loving crowd, I will give you the 2 bits of quantitative data I have to compare Draft 1 and Draft 2. So we'll talk about the word count and the chapter count. Draft 1 of Wreck and Ruin, I really didn't plan on the word flow of my title. My first draft completed came out to be around 104,280 words, with a total of 62 chapters. My Draft 2 is currently sitting at a nice 120,133 words, and my chapter total is 45. I basically wrote about 14 to 16,000 more words, 16,000 more words, but I ended up decreasing my chapter count by over 10 chapters. And that's because when I was dividing Draft 1 into chapters, they weren't really story level chapters. It was more of an organizational system for me to keep track on the current scene and plot beats that I was working through. So when I was going through Draft 1 and making a plan for Draft 2, I realized reading through the draft that there were a good amount of chapters from Draft 1 that could have been absorbed into more cohesive chapter arcs for Draft 2. Now, I still have to work on it. I do think there are some clunky areas and some of the flow between my chapters aren't necessarily great, but I do hope that in Draft 2, the actual chapters read closer to actual chapters than they did in Draft 1. Okay, let's head back and chat about some of the issues in Draft 1 that I tried to address in Draft 2. And before I continue on, I have to give an absolute megalodon-sized shout out to my early readers. It may have been a little too early for me to ask and receive feedback on Draft 1 with how rough it was, but I will say that without the feedback and the suggestions that I received, I don't know if Draft 2 would be where it is today. I really do think that having that early input was very helpful for me, and I still have input from Draft 1 that I need to address, and will probably have to address that in Draft 3, because my story needed a lot of work, and it still needs a lot of work, but I'm just hoping that these are increments of growth as I continue along in the process. All right, I want to share with you probably 2 of the biggest issues that I tried to tackle going into Draft 2. Now, there's a chance that this could just be one overall issue, but I'm going to divide it into basically like 2 different talking points. The biggest issue overall in Draft 1 was not necessarily the character, plot, or world building elements. It was kind of everything. Clarity was the biggest issue. There were parts, very crucial parts of my story that my readers were confused on, and that was because even though I understood it, all the information was in my head, I didn't do a great job of putting it down on paper. Like, it would have been better if I just info dumped some of the information, maybe that's not as engaging, but at least my readers would have had some sort of context and information on some of the things that weren't very clear in the first draft. So even before I tried to target some of the deeper elements, some of my character internality and the tension, I wanted to make sure that my story was clear. So draft 2, the goal was just make sure the story was easy to follow, even if it's not super engaging at this point. Just put the information there, make sure it flows so that if a reader were to read it, they would be able to tell me the big points of the plot that I was trying to make. I'll give you a little bit of an example and why I think there was also some confusion in draft 1. I realized that even though I was writing in third person limited, I was trying to follow one primary character in draft 1, I head hopped. I was actually writing from the perspective of 2 different characters while trying to really specifically follow just one character, and I think that was a bit jarring. The head hopping also wasn't very intentional. I didn't realize how many times I jumped into one of my other characters' like thoughts and feelings for just a couple sentences or so, and then went right back to my primary character. Although I will say that being able to address this and having someone point it out to me, it did give me something very specific and actionable to work on in draft 2. So for draft 2, rather than focusing on only one character's perspective, I added in another character's perspective. To give you a little bit of context, my female lead, my primary character, is ripped from everything that she knows. And when you're writing from a character that is already confused and already doesn't know elements of the world, adding in a perspective that understands the world a little clearer, that has other parts of the story that the other character can't tell, I think will help clarify some of the confusion. The other main issue of draft 1 was the ending of the story itself. Reading through my first draft, I realized that I was actually writing 1.5 books. I was trying to fit a story that was better told as a series into a standalone, and I would say that maybe the last 20 chapters of draft 1 were really a glorified outline to parts of a second book. So in draft 2, I changed the ending. Draft 2 is officially the first draft of the first book in a fantasy series. That's a pretty major difference. My draft 1 attempted to be a standalone. Draft 2 knows more about what it is. It is the draft of a first book. And I think that by giving myself that room to explore the story and the characters, I think it helps set me up for the future drafts to work on some of the issues that I'm still having and some of the feedback that I still have to address from my early readers. Now let me get a little vulnerable. A few days ago, I almost scrapped the story completely. Like, wiped the slate clean. I had finished draft 2 and decided this wasn't going to be good enough. I gotta restart, I gotta trash it. Of Wreck and Ruin is not the first book I've written. It is the first one to have made it this far. It's the first to have survived my random bouts of fear and anxiety and insecurity, and has saved itself from being put into the trash can on my computer and wiped for good. Yes, I've done that to countless stories in my lifetime. And we're gonna move on because I don't even want to think about all the ideas that I have trashed, because I decided in probably more of an insecurity than an objective truth that it just was never going to be good enough to meet the eyes of the public. Fortunately, draft 2 is safe and sound, and I owe it to basically 3 people. I have also officially signed up for an editorial assessment with a developmental editor. And as of 24 hours ago, more like 18 hours ago, draft 2 is in a professional's hand. If it wasn't for these 3 individuals, I might not even have a draft 2. So this is, I think, somewhat of a defining moment in my writing career, is to have a book that has survived this long, that has made it into the hands of a professional and has made it to the eyes of other readers. So I have hope. And I also know that draft 2 is an early edition of my current manuscript, that there are many more drafts to go. And so just because it's not perfect now doesn't mean it won't get where it needs to be later, even if it takes a little bit more time. While draft 2 is being reviewed by the developmental editor, I'm going to take some time. I'm going to give myself some creative freedom to perhaps work on the outline or brainstorm the second book, to look at some of the other projects that I might want to start writing, and to also use this time to work on my craft, to try to actively improve my writing skill through practice and not just trying to write 120,000 words. So this concludes this little episode of Writing Reflections. Thank you to everyone who has made it this far. Please let me know how it's going on your end. And I would also love to hear what you think the biggest changes are between your draft 1s and draft 2s if you've made it that far. So with that, I'm going to wish you luck, and I hope to see you and catch you guys later. Ooh, what happened here? Wyatt, do something.